It was just after midnight when the silence of Breonna Taylor's apartment shattered. Louisville slept, unaware that in one small home, a life was about to be torn apart by assumptions, fear, and power moving faster than truth. Breonna had spent the day doing what she always did, caring for others. A 26-year-old emergency room technician, she knew the language of pain and healing. She believed in systems, in rules, in the idea that if you did the right thing, the world would meet you with fairness. That belief would not survive the night. Breonna was home with her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker. The apartment was modest, familiar, safe. Or at least it was supposed to be. Outside, plainclothes officers approached with a warrant built on flawed intelligence and dangerous assumptions. They believed drugs were involved. They believed the apartment was part of something criminal. They believed force was justified. What they did not fully believe in was the humanity of the woman inside. The knock, if there was one, was lost in the chaos that followed. The door came down. To Kenneth, it felt like a break-in. Fear replaced reason in a split second. He fired a single shot, believing he was protecting his home. That moment, driven by panic and confusion, triggered a cascade of gunfire that would never be undone. Bullets tore through walls, furniture, and flesh. Breonna Taylor was struck multiple times. She collapsed in the hallway she walked through every day, the place she once felt safest. The underdog in this story was not armed. She was not dangerous. She was not a suspect. She was a woman whose life revolved around healing others, reduced to a footnote in a police report before her body was even cold. Power had entered her home uninvited, and it did not pause to confirm it was in the right place. In the hours that followed, the narrative began to take shape. Carefully, deliberately, officials framed the raid as necessary. Mistakes were minimized. Language softened. Breonna's name faded behind legal terms and procedural explanations. The system closed ranks, protecting itself before protecting the truth. Dramatic irony hung heavy in the air. The very institution Breonna served as a healthcare worker would not extend the same care to her life or her death. But outside that apartment, something began to stir. Her family refused silence. Friends refused to forget. Activists refused the official version. Questions multiplied. Why was the warrant approved? Why was the intelligence outdated? Why was a no-knock raid used at all? The more answers failed to appear, the louder the outrage grew. Breonna Taylor's story traveled far beyond Louisville. Her name appeared on signs, in hashtags, in chants echoing through streets across America. She became a symbol of how easily flawed assumptions turn deadly when combined with unchecked authority. The underdog, silenced in her own hallway, had found a voice through millions of others. The power dynamic shifted not in a courtroom, but in public consciousness. The raid that was supposed to be routine became a national reckoning. Journalists uncovered inconsistencies. Officials contradicted themselves. The story that once felt controlled began to unravel. Each revelation stripped away another layer of institutional certainty, exposing fear, bias, and haste beneath the badge. Kenneth Walker's charges were dropped. The narrative that painted him as a criminal collapsed under scrutiny. Breonna's family filed a civil lawsuit, and a settlement followed. Money changed hands, but justice felt incomplete. No amount could replace a life lost, a future erased. Still, the settlement was an acknowledgement, quiet but undeniable, that something had gone terribly wrong. And then came the grand jury decision. Officers were not charged for Breonna Taylor's death. One charge emerged, not for taking a life, but for endangering neighbors. The room filled with disbelief, anger, and grief. Once again, the system protected its own. Once again, justice felt abstract, distant, conditional. Yet the irony deepened. In trying to shield itself, the system had exposed its cracks to the entire world. Breonna Taylor's name was no longer just a name. It was a question. It was a challenge. It was a demand for change that refused to fade. Policies began to shift. No-knock warrants were banned in some places. Police practices were reviewed. Conversations once avoided became unavoidable. The underdog had forced power to respond, even if reluctantly. Breonna Taylor, underestimated in life and dismissed in death, had altered the landscape of accountability. The life lesson cuts deep and uncomfortable. when assumptions replace evidence, when fear outruns verification, and when power moves without empathy, innocent lives pay the price. Justice is not always delivered through handcuffs and courtrooms. Sometimes it arrives as awareness, reform, and a collective refusal to accept silence. And yet, the story does not end cleanly. Breonna Taylor's case remains a wound in the national conscience. The question lingers in every late-night knock, every raid approved without scrutiny, every system that claims to protect while failing to listen. How many other doors stand between safety and tragedy? How many other lives balance on flawed assumptions waiting to be tested? Breonna Taylor went to work saving lives. She died because hers was treated as expendable. But in the wake of her death, something shifted. The underdog was finally seen. The powerful were finally questioned. And the suspense remains heavy and unresolved. Will the lessons learned be enough to stop the next name from joining hers? Or will history repeat itself in another quiet home, just after midnight? In the days after Breonna Taylor's name began to circle the country, the machinery of power did what it always does when exposed. It slowed, recalibrated, and spoke in careful tones. Statements were released that sounded polished but hollow, filled with phrases like procedure, protocol, and tragic outcome. None of them said her name the way her mother did. None of them captured the reality that a life built on care and service had been reduced to a debate over paperwork. Behind closed doors, officials reviewed timelines and reports, not to understand Breonna, but to protect the system that had failed her. The city moved forward as if routine could erase grief. But outside those offices, something had already changed. The silence was breaking. Protests grew louder, not out of chaos, but out of exhaustion. People were no longer asking politely to be heard. They were demanding it. Say her name wasn't a slogan. It was a refusal to let her disappear. Each chant pressed against the walls of authority, forcing attention where avoidance had once been enough. For the first time, those who held power realized the story was no longer theirs to control. The investigation became public, and with it came contradictions. Timelines shifted. Explanations evolved. What had once been described as clear and justified now sounded uncertain under scrutiny. Every new detail raised another question. If the assumptions were flawed, who approved them? If the intelligence was weak, why was it acted on with such confidence? These questions followed officials into press conferences and courtrooms, and suddenly, the underdog, the family, the community, the public held leverage. This was the second power shift, quieter but more dangerous to those at the top, because it wasn't fueled by anger alone, but by persistence. Lawsuits followed, not as a demand for money, but as a demand for acknowledgement. Breonna's family stood firm, not as symbols, but as people who refused to accept half answers. Their grief was steady, controlled, and impossible to dismiss. The city eventually agreed to a settlement, calling it closure. But closure is a word institutions use when they want an ending. For the people who love Breonna, it was only a pause. Policy changes were announced. New rules were written. Officials stood behind podiums promising reform, speaking as if change were a gift rather than correction. And yet, even these shifts mattered, because systems do not change from remorse. They change from pressure. Breonna Taylor's story became a mirror, reflecting truths many had tried not to see. That safety is uneven. That authority often moves faster than accountability. That being innocent does not always mean being protected. The dramatic irony cut deep. A woman who spent her life responding to emergencies became the victim of one created by assumption. And the system designed to safeguard life struggled to explain why it could not safeguard hers. As months passed, the headlines faded, but the consequences did not. Breonna's name remained present in classrooms, in legislation, in conversations that once avoided discomfort. She became a standard against which actions were measured. Was this necessary? Was this just? Was this preventable? In that sense, justice had begun to work, not as punishment, but as exposure. Still, one truth lingered unresolved. Justice that arrives after loss is never complete. It teaches lessons, but it does not restore what was taken. The final power shift, the most unsettling one, belonged not to the courts or the city, but to the public. Because once people see how easily assumptions become decisions, they can never unsee it. Breonna Taylor's story forced a reckoning that could not be undone. And yet, the system that failed her still exists, altered but intact, capable of repeating its mistakes if attention fades. That is the cliffhanger no one wants to admit. The question left hanging isn't whether Breonna Taylor deserved justice. It's whether the changes made in her name will endure when the cameras turn away. Because somewhere right now, another ordinary person is trusting that the rules will protect them. And Part 3 asks the hardest question of all. What happens when they don't? Time moved forward, but the weight of Breonna Taylor's story stayed, suspended over the city like unfinished business. In courtrooms, language became a shield. Words were chosen carefully, shaped to avoid blame while appearing thorough. Investigations narrowed instead of widened, focusing on technicalities rather than consequences. To the system, precision mattered more than purpose. To the public, it felt like justice shrinking in real time. Each legal update carried an unspoken message. Accountability has limits, and those limits are often drawn by power. Yet outside the walls of official proceedings, Breonna's name continued to grow louder, not softer. Artists painted her face on boarded storefronts. Teachers spoke her story in classrooms. Parents used her name to explain fear to their children. She was no longer just a victim of one night. She had become a symbol of a pattern many recognized from their own lives. This was not chaos. It was memory refusing to fade. And memory, when shared, becomes pressure. Politicians who once avoided the topic now reference it carefully, measuring each word against public reaction. New policies were debated with urgency that had never existed before. No-knock warrants were questioned, restricted, even banned in some places. Officials called it progress. Critics called it overdue. But even incremental change signaled something important. Breonna Taylor's life had altered the rules of the game. The underdog effect was real. A woman with no platform had forced institutions to respond simply by the weight of her absence. Still, the irony remained sharp. Reform moved faster than accountability. Laws changed more easily than outcomes. The people responsible for decisions at night continued their lives with protection and procedure, while Breonna's family lived with loss that no policy could undo. This imbalance became the quiet tension beneath every announcement of progress. Justice, it seemed, was willing to adjust itself, but not fully confront itself. And that realization changed the tone of the movement. Hope matured into vigilance. People learned that attention is power, but only while it lasts. The story shifted from outrage to resolve, from reaction to strategy. Activists studied policy language. Communities organized locally. The demand was no longer just to say her name, but to make sure it meant something tomorrow, not just today. Breonna Taylor's story exposed a deeper truth. Systems rarely collapse under moral weight alone. They bend when watched continuously. That awareness became the final transformation of power. The public was no longer waiting for justice to arrive. It was positioning itself to enforce memory as a form of accountability. Yet uncertainty lingered, because movements depend on endurance, and endurance is tested by time. As headlines fade and new crises compete for attention, the risk is not reversal, it is forgetting, and forgetting is where systems regain comfort. Breonna's story now sits at a crossroads between legacy and lesson. The question is no longer whether her life mattered. That answer is clear. The question is whether the changes made in her name will survive distraction, resistance, and fatigue. Part 4 follows what happens when attention shifts, when reform meets resistance behind closed doors, and when the true cause of justice is measured not in promises, but in persistence. As the attention slowly drifted, resistance quietly reorganized itself, not in public statements or loud declarations, but in meetings without cameras and decisions buried in fine print. Reforms that once sounded bold were softened by exceptions. Oversight committees were formed, then underfunded. Reviews were promised, then delayed. The system did not push back. It waited. This was its oldest strategy. Time, after all, is a powerful ally of authority. For Breonna Taylor's family, grief became a long-distance run, not a sprint. Each new hurdle required the same strength as the first, only now without the crowds. Yet they persisted, learning the language of policy and procedure, refusing to let fatigue decide the outcome. Community leaders followed suit, tracking votes, monitoring enforcement, asking the questions that made officials uncomfortable. The pressure never fully disappeared. It changed shape. It became quieter, sharper, more informed. And that made it dangerous to those who preferred symbolic change over structural truth. In some places, the reforms held. In others, old habits resurfaced under new names. Training replaced accountability. Promises replaced consequences. The dramatic irony deepened. The system praised progress while repeating the behaviors that made progress necessary. Still, something irreversible had occurred. The public had learned how power evades responsibility, and that knowledge could not be unlearned. Journalists revisited timelines with fresh eyes. Advocates compared outcomes across cities, revealing patterns no single case could hide. Breonna Taylor's story became connective tissue, linking past failures to present debates. It was no longer an isolated tragedy. It was evidence, and evidence has weight. When officials spoke, audiences listened differently, hearing what was missing as clearly as what was said. This shift unsettled the balance. Authority thrives on trust that goes unquestioned. Breonna's legacy made questioning routine. The life lessons sharpened into focus. Justice is not a moment. It is maintenance. It demands attention when it is boring, persistence when it is unpopular, and courage when it is costly. The cliff edge approached quietly. Because the final test was not whether reforms existed on paper, but whether they would hold when the next decision arrived, when assumptions tempted speed, when scrutiny dimmed. Part 5 confronts that test. The next moment of pressure, the next ordinary night, and whether the lessons learned in Breonna Taylor's name will stand when it matters most. The months and years after Breonna Taylor's death revealed how tenuous change can be. Some policies were revised. No-knock warrants were restricted. Officers underwent additional training. The headlines announced progress. But the real test of justice always comes in the quiet moments, away from cameras and microphones. Behind the scenes, the system continued to operate, balancing scrutiny with self-preservation. The officers involved returned to duty under different titles, protected by rules that shielded their actions while the public watched for accountability. Breonna's family continued their advocacy, navigating legal hurdles and public attention simultaneously. They became educators, organizers, and voices demanding that her story not fade into statistics or memory. Their persistence forced lawmakers to reconsider laws, and their advocacy inspired protests and discussions across the country. Communities once hesitant now tracked local enforcement practices and reviewed cases that might have been overlooked before. The underdog struggle had shifted the balance of influence, not by legal verdict alone, but through persistent, organized pressure and collective awareness. Dramatic irony lingered. The system attempted to assert control, yet the moral weight of public attention continually exposed its flaws. Breonna Taylor's name became a symbol not just of a life lost, but of power questioned, assumptions challenged, and authority held accountable in the court of public conscience. The lessons were clear and urgent. Assumptions can be deadly. Oversight is essential, and justice is only meaningful when paired with vigilance and action. And yet, despite reforms and awareness, the story remained incomplete. Authority continues to operate. Flawed intelligence continues to exist, and ordinary lives still hang in the balance. The suspense remains unresolved. Will the measures taken in Breonna Taylor's name prevent the next tragedy, or will systemic weaknesses allow history to repeat itself? The story does not close neatly. Part 6 will explore the ongoing fight for justice, examining how Breonna's legacy shapes law, policy, and social consciousness, and whether vigilance will endure or fade in the quiet moments when no one is watching. The underdog struggle continues, a tense, haunting reminder that accountability is never permanent, and the fight for justice is never truly finished. Before you continue watching, I need you to take a moment and hit that subscribe button. This channel dives deep into stories that the mainstream media often overlooks. Stories that reveal injustice, bias, and the harsh realities of our world. Tamir Rice's story is one of those stories. A 12-year-old child, judged as a threat within seconds, whose life was stolen in an instant. By subscribing, you're not just following a channel. You're joining a community that values truth, accountability, and the voices of those who were silenced far too soon. Turn on notifications, because every time a story drops, you'll be at the front line of awareness, seeing events unfold that everyone needs to understand. Now, take a moment to reflect on what happened to Tamir, a boy, 12 years old, holding a toy gun, shot within seconds of being perceived as dangerous. It's a story that is heartbreaking, horrifying, and tragically preventable. Comment below and share your thoughts. How do you feel knowing that a child could be judged and killed in an instant? What changes do you believe need to happen to prevent future tragedies like this? Every comment adds to the conversation. Every opinion keeps this story alive. When you share your voice, you help demand accountability from the institutions that allowed this to happen. You help make sure Tamir Rice is remembered not just as a name in a news report, but as a child whose life mattered. Sharing this video is just as important. Click that share button and send this story to your friends, family, and social media networks. Every view, every share spreads awareness. It sparks conversations in homes, in schools, in communities. The more people who see it, the more pressure there is for reform, oversight, and accountability. Awareness alone is enough. But awareness plus action can make a real difference. You have the power to ensure that Tamir Rice's story reaches beyond the screen and becomes a catalyst for change. Engaging with this content, subscribing, commenting, sharing, isn't just about supporting a channel. It's about standing up for justice. It's about ensuring that the lessons from Tamir Rice's death are not forgotten. It's about reminding the world that children deserve protection, that lives matter, and that silence in the face of injustice is never acceptable. By engaging, you join a growing movement demanding that authority, policy, and culture change to prevent the next tragedy. Finally, know this, your actions matter. Subscribing ensures you see more stories that expose injustice. Commenting gives your voice power. Sharing spreads awareness to thousands more. Every single interaction ensures that Tamir Rice's story and the lessons it teaches about humanity, perception, and bias remains alive and relevant. Don't just watch the story. Be part of it. Be part of the conversation. Be part of the change. Hit subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video now. Every action counts. Together, we can make sure stories like Tamir Rice's are never forgotten, and that society takes the steps needed to protect the children of tomorrow.